Hi, Suzanne. My name is Mike. I'm the program director at Farm Table. We have a few other folks coming in. Andy's here, of course, from Farmer to Farmer Coffee.
I think one thing that we could do is just to introduce ourselves. I'm going to actually introduce myself during the talk, but
yeah,
I could start by saying that my name's Andy, and one thing that I love about the fall in Wisconsin is the sweet root vegetables that we grow on our farm. And so we roast a lot of like squash and carrots and beets and turnips and things like that. So there's a lot of sweetness in those fall vegetables. It's really good to introduce ourselves to each other and say something you love about the fall.
Suzanne, do you want to go ahead?
Ooh. I think it's just a time for reflection and slowing down, because I am a gardener as well and grower. So I kind of take stock of what happened and just relish in all the successes and the new relationships I've built. And it just feels kind of good to slow down a little bit, because summers are fast and furious, and I love that too, but fall's great.
Hi, Amy. We're just doing introductions of our names and something that we love about the fall.
I'll go ahead. My name is Mike Scott. I'm the program director at Farm Table. And let's see, I love the crisp air, like when you walk and you get a little bit of the cheeks burning a little bit. That's so refreshing to me. So I actually really enjoy that.
Anyway, I love the fall colors. They're gone now, but I think this year was magnificent, and we got out to enjoy them quite a bit.
Yay.
Good.
Great. Want me to go?
Yeah.
Okay, Stephanie Lundeen. I have Cafe Run and Luck, and I love fall because you can see deeper into the woods.
So as more people come in, if it makes sense, I'll pause and let them introduce themselves. I might just like wait till the end to acknowledge. The talk, basically I'm going to talk about how climate change affects coffee growing and how coffee growing can adapt to that, and actually like different growing practices that that can actually make things better. Okay, so I had the whole talk all set up, and then there was a hurricane that hit Honduras last week, and so I just wanted to start with that, because that's one of the main like things that you might see as an effect from climate change is more hurricanes and worse ones. So here's just an aerial view of the north coast of Honduras.
Están destruidas y extensas zonas han quedado cubiertas por el agua. Miles de personas esperan encaramadas en los tejados de sus casas que alguien acuda en su auxilio, pero faltan los medios y la situación es cada vez más crítica.
Los rescatamos a mis hermanos, a toda la familia que vive
del país. Se habla de al menos 13 muertos, pero la extensión del desastre no se podrá conocer hasta que se retire el agua que cubre el extenso valle de Sula, donde podría haber 2 millones de damnificados. La tormenta tropical también ha azotado Panamá.
So there's a real link. When it's warmer, it evaporates more water from the surfaces of the planet, both the oceans and the land surfaces, and that water causes droughts when it evaporates and floods when it falls. So every time there's a hurricane, it's going to be more intense with climate change. This is a photo that I was sent a couple days ago. One of our coffee farmers. These red marks, that's where there were landslides on the mountain, and that's one of the coffee farmers' houses. So it's now uninhabitable, which is kind of sad, very sad actually. And this is one of those farmers. This is Mancho and his kids and his brother Benito. And this is Patrocinio. So all three of these farmers, their families are going to have to find a new place to live, that their actual houses are too close to a landslide. Before I get going, I'd like to make note that we are on traditional Anishinaabe and Dakota land. Here in this area, there are still Anishinaabe and Dakota people living in the communities and among us, and it's really important for us to notice that the treaties that they signed are still active and are important. And I just wanted to pause before we got into everything else to acknowledge that. Just a couple things to start with. Who am I? I was in the Peace Corps volunteer in Honduras from 1993 to 96. I was a protected areas volunteer. And I have to turn off my self view, it's trouble. And as a protected areas volunteer, I was assigned to a national park, and the top part of a mountain, a cloud forest, had been designated a national park 5 years prior to me showing up. And it hadn't had any sort of like development or boundaries or guards or anything. So it was just sort of a paper park at the time. And so that was sort of my job, was to work with people around the park. And some of them were coffee farmers who I met at that time. I've been a Montessori teacher and a small scale vegetable farmer for the last like 25 years. And I joined Farmer to Farmer in 2000 when I moved out to Wisconsin. I returned to Honduras in 2003 on my honeymoon, and I met up with some coffee farmers, and they were like, "Hey, Andres, maybe you would want to sell our coffee too." And I said, "Well, I'll find out." And that started a relationship where we started bringing up delegations in 2005, bringing down delegations and bringing up coffee. And I've made many, many trips. I try to go every year to Honduras and visit the farmers and also my friends from my Peace Corps times, most recently in January of 2020. And Sue was on that trip, and Amy's been on some of these previous trips as well. Let's see. Here we go. So there's me, younger days, with Alex, who was one of the trip guys who went with me one year. And this is Doña Cirila. She's a coffee farmer who's also a grandma. And we got to see her just this year, surrounded by her grandchildren. This is some of the coffee farmers. There's Patrocinio, Mancho, and Benito, and there's Roman, Alex, Adelaide, Edwin, and then Don Francisco. So there's a group of about 13 different families who send coffee up, and they formed an organic coffee co-op. This is Hector. He was like my best friend when I was in the Peace Corps, and we worked to protect the park. And then he went on to be really interested in organic coffee. And so this is him with some of his baby coffee plants, talking about how to farm organically. This is coffee up at Don Francisco's place, just ripe and abundant. This is my partner in life, Jen, and this is our goddaughter, Sochi. And Sochi and her mom, Priscilla, I lived at Priscilla's house when I was in the Peace Corps, and Sochi was born during that time, and so I was like Uncle Andy. And so now Jen and I are godparents. Here's another delegation. This is Vicky, who went twice with us to Honduras, and she has since passed. So it's Really, she left a legacy. People keep asking about her. This airport actually flooded during the hurricane. And I just saw some photos of it completely full of mud. This is my friend Melvin, who was like our first park guard back in the day. And he was a guide for us. And he can actually cut a trail with his machete through undergrowth as fast as I can walk. So basically, he's an amazing person. There's another of our groups that went. This is what most of the roads look like down there. Not a road, just dirt. So we'll talk climate change basics. Let's see if I can see this. Okay. I don't know that I have to explain this very much, but as humans, we've shifted more and more carbon to the atmosphere. And carbon in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide and methane, it traps heat that would otherwise have escaped. And the rising temperatures from this trapped heat evaporates more water from the surface. We already talked about this. More and more frequent and more intense droughts, like in California, or the drought in Syria that precipitated the political crisis, which led to the refugee crisis, and more and more frequent intense rainfall events. And we see that even in the Midwest. We had 8 inches rain this summer. That was ridiculous. And then the rising temperatures, in addition to affecting water cycle, also affect growing conditions, pests, and diseases. It's pretty straightforward. Now, how does this connect to coffee? So I'm going to talk about the background information about coffee. I'm going to talk about the impact of climate change on the coffee, and then a potential to adapt coffee techniques to climate change and ways for us to mitigate climate change. We'll talk about how important coffee is, talk about some basic biology and what's going on with coffee. All right, so the main thing to know is coffee is really important around the world. More than 60 countries grow coffee and more than 25 million families. And Brazil is big. I think Honduras is somewhere around number 5 or 6, depending on which year. And so not just the coffee farmers are supported, because once that money comes into the country, it allows other jobs to exist. And so the livelihoods of more than 125 million people are affected by coffee. It's good to know some biology here. The word Arabica coffee and Robusta coffee. So Arabica is the main coffee that we think of when we think of coffee. It's grown in the mountains, it's hand harvested, and that's really the coffee flavor that we get. And it can be shade or sun grown, but it's susceptible to disease. And so that susceptibility to disease is moderated by growing it in the mountains and cooler temperatures, where the diseases are less predominant. It also, it matures more slowly in the mountains, and it develops flavors over a longer period of time. So people will think of this Arabica as superior in flavor to the Robusta. Now, Robusta is a higher caffeine, which means it resists insects stronger, and then it also resists disease better. It's got a bitter taste, and it's sun-grown, and it can be grown in lower elevations. And basically, it's grown as something that you mix in with Arabica for what you might think of as like Folgers or something like that. So to stretch out the Arabica. Now, when you want to have high quality coffee, you generally just have strictly high grown Arabica coffee, and that's what we'd get, hand harvested, certified organic. But it's good to know about Robusta, because that's going to affect the price of coffee. So all of that Robusta coffee that's machine harvested is pulling down the global price of coffee, which affects the price for hand harvested coffee. And that's why we don't really grow much coffee in developed nations. It's not just because it's a tropical crop. Like you can grow coffee in parts of California, but they won't because it's just not worth it because of the low prices. I've got a couple videos that just to show the efficiency of machine harvesting. So we're gonna go to Colombia here, and let's see.
Labor intensive, but hand picking is the only way to avoid unripe coffee.
Coffee is going to taste best if it's picked when it's ripe and processed immediately. So good pickers have to be selective and pick coffee that's just at the right stage of ripeness in order to get coffee that's ultimately going to taste good.
So that's just a short clip of what it's like to hand harvest coffee. I think of it like when I'm picking blueberries. I pick one blueberry, two blueberries, three blueberries, and I put it in my little bucket. And you can imagine after like an hour, I've got like, a fat gallon or a gallon and a half of blueberries. And if you were doing that for coffee, you wouldn't make any money. You have to pick faster than that. Sue got to pick coffee in January, and you know how much work it is. Let's see what a machine harvesting coffee looks like. I love the music here. Anyway, so you can just tell that hand harvesting coffee is a really slow way to make money, and machine harvesting is much faster. There's me hand picking, and that's us. After just an hour of picking, we've got a few berries, coffee cherries. Sue, this is Dardiella. You probably met Dardiella when she was like 10 years older than that. So knowing that machine harvesting is already bringing down the prices, and knowing that the Robusta beans are also bringing down the prices, our farmers are dealing with something that was brought on by climate change called La Roya. La Roya is known in English as coffee rust. So in 2012, there was an outbreak that hit Central America that wiped out many coffee farms entirely. And they had to replant. Most of our farms took 3 years off as they replanted and were able to come back into production with resistant varieties. And then in 2017, some of the ones that they replanted, the Roya must have mutated or adapted. La Roya is a fungus, and it responds to temperature and moisture. So the warmer and wetter it is, the more likely it is the fungus will grow. And so one of the things the coffee farmers did was they would try to remove shade trees, and that would improve the airflow and have less moisture that sits around the tree. And we do that with fruit trees here in Wisconsin. Like, you want to prune your tree to increase airflow, to stop fungal diseases. But if you imagine a whole mountainside of farmers removing shade trees, it actually increases the air temperature on that mountain, because you don't have the trees transpiring and cooling off the surround. So the microclimate on the mountain increases in temperature, and it had a counterproductive effect. And so farmers now are they want to regulate their shade trees, but they don't want to get rid of them all the way. What they noticed, economic impact of La Roya was 1.7 million jobs were lost in Central America. So this is climate change causing a job loss in Central America. Now, where do you think those people wanted to go? they're actually climate refugees. This is what La Roya looks like. You can see why they call it coffee rust. And now another impact of climate change is something called La Broca. La Broca is one of the reasons why they plant higher and higher up on the mountain, because there's an insect that specializes in laying its eggs inside of a coffee bean. And it drops the egg off, and then the egg hatches, and the larva lives its whole life hollowing out the bean, and then emerges for one day to mate, and then they drop their eggs off again. So it's a very hard insect to control. And the pesticides that are used on conventional coffee are significant. And the best way to control it is to not be in a warm place. The Robusta will resist La Broca because of the high caffeine content. But the Arabica does not have as much resistance. So La Broca will go through generations during a coffee season. And the warmer it is, the more generations it'll go through. And that will affect the size of the bean, the flavor of the bean, the number of high quality beans versus low quality beans. And the machines that they use to process the beans will kick out the bad beans. And so our farmers will spend hours picking and then get only half as much because the machine will have kicked out all the bad beans from La Broca. So here it is. They were looking at climate change models going from 1 to 5 generations in a year to 5 to 16 generations per year. So then we talked about the shade grown versus sun grown earlier, but I do have a reminder to tell the story from my Peace Corps days. So when I was in the Peace Corps, coffee seemed like an idyllic crop because I would visit these mountainside communities and they would have shade trees and coffee plants, and they'd have fruit trees and bananas all amidst it, and the chickens are running around and everybody's like drinking coffee and happy. And they would also grow hardwood trees in and among the coffee. And so I started to like talk to the farmers, and one of the farmers told me that it wasn't always like this. There was something called the Green New Deal, or the Green New Deal, the Green Revolution, where farmers from the United States or agricultural technicians from the United States were sent all over the world to teach developing countries how to improve their agriculture. And so they went into Central America and said, you know, what you need to do is have higher production varieties, hybrids, and improved varieties. And then you need to cut down the shade trees. So prior to like 1980, most coffee was grown using like heirloom varieties, and there was grown under like jungle shade. And then this Green Revolution comes, they come in with higher production varieties, they cut down the shade trees, and they start producing 2 or 3 times as much coffee. And this is happening all over the world. But you know what happens when you double or triple the production of coffee on the worldwide level without teaching more people to drink it, is you have a glut on the commodity market. And that glut drove prices down and down and down. And they never really have recovered since then. But what happens when you have low priced coffee and you've already cut down your shade trees? Well, you can't afford to pay for the herbicide that you need because you don't have the shade trees to block out the sun that would have kept the grass weeds down. So all the coffee plantations filled in with grassy weeds, and they were just lost. And so now the farmers are looking for more sustainability, because like they had to recover from all that good advice they were given. And so now with shade trees, especially shade trees that are in the legume family, you get enough sun cover that the grassy weeds don't come in. And they also, it's less stress on the plants, but you get fewer yields. Let's go to the next one. In the long term, we've already talked about why sun-grown coffee is not sustainable, because the higher yields, the higher use of herbicides, the higher use of pesticides, the warmer temperatures, all of those things mean that it's really hard on the soil. You're also not putting anything back in the soil like you would with shade trees that drop their leaves. So this is a sort of half shade, half sun plantation picture. The ones we see in Honduras are almost full shade. This is a full sun plantation. It's just like only coffee. And here's Hector in his like full shade plantation that has like pine trees and oak trees and stuff in there. That's another full shade plantation. And you can see there's usually plants on the undergrowth, but usually these are sort of like forest plants versus grassy plants. And it makes a big difference. And they're actually there like a living mulch. So now we talked about how coffee grows. We know about Arabica versus Robusta. We know about machine versus hand harvesting. We know about sun versus shade growing. And how does like climate change impact the coffee? So the growing conditions. So we talked about why Arabica needs to grow on the mountainside. The ideal is between 1,000 and 1,500 meters above sea level. And it can shift higher or lower. And it actually does. We see this in Honduras. With more moisture, they can grow it lower on the mountain. But the higher up you go, the better the coffee is. And so scientists are saying that coffee growing conditions might shift 200 to 400 meters up the mountain. And that might be okay in some parts of Honduras, but most of Honduras doesn't have 200 to 400 meters to go up. There's just air up there. And so there's the best coffee growing land is gonna reduce in Honduras. They say by as much as 88%. So just the growing conditions are gonna change due to climate change, which, people are predicting that. And it can also affect quality as well. We talked about how back in the 80s, they had these heirloom varieties that would grow under, the cloud forest. And they would they showed it to me and they were like, Andres, you should try this coffee. This is the best coffee we've ever had. And it's huge beans and it's the best flavor. They call it Cafe Indio. And these Cafe Indio plants would be like a rangy tree that could be like 30 feet tall and just have a few berries here and there. And the improved varieties, the ones that can resist the coffee rust, they don't produce as big of cherry and they don't taste as good. And so we're gonna see climate change, especially if they have to do more hybrids between Arabica and Robusta in order to resist the Broca. The coffee is just gonna not taste as good as it did 10 years and 15 and 20 years ago in a few years. So we've already talked about La Roya, and cutting down the trees actually doesn't help. It just makes it worse because as a whole mountainside full of people cut down the shade trees, it gets warmer, which makes it worse again. All right. Uh-oh, I did something. So as an organic vegetable farmer, I know that one of the best things I can do to prevent like disease in my tomato plants is to have the plants be healthy. And so one of the things that researchers were looking at was that well-hydrated and less stressed plants are more resistant to disease. And so one of the effects of climate change is you're going to have erratic rainfall. the seasons are unpredictable anymore. And so in Honduras, they might have rainfall in the middle of what would have been the dry season, because the shifting, the Gulf Stream, or the versions of the Gulf Stream that you have in Central America, the movement of wind and weather systems changes through the climate change. And so different rainfall patterns are going to affect the plants and their health. And that's going to be trouble. Here's La Roya. And there's Edwin on the right with a resistant plant. And behind him is the Cafe Indio that they're taking out. So the Broca, that's that insect. So one of the things that happens, like on my organic farm, is that we look to natural controls of insects. So we plant flowers amidst the broccoli, and what we're doing is we're attracting parasitic wasps that will then eat the caterpillars that eat the broccoli. And so when you look at the Broca, this insect, any monoculture of coffee is going to make an insect infestation worse, because there's no way for the farmers to have an intact ecosystem that could moderate the explosion of insect population. So there are birds and parasitic wasps, and all of those require other things than a coffee plant to survive. So shade trees are going to help. Natural corridors, nearby intact cloud forests, things like that are all going to make it easier for an organic farm to resist the Broca. But what happens with coffee farmers as they're trying to resist the fungal diseases is they cut down those shade trees and they plant more and more coffee. And with lower prices, they also plant more in order to make more money. And so you're ending up having to use insecticides, and that's really expensive. This is another impact of climate change, is that bee habitat is going to change with climate change. Not just the fact that farmers are cutting down the trees and planting more coffee, but also temperature is going to change the bee habitat. And so that actually affects the yield on the coffee as well. And then, we were talking about how predictability of rainfall and temperature is going out the window in Central America. So they're having heat waves when they used to have a cold season, and cold seasons when they used to have a heat wave. We're seeing the same thing here. They call it, instead of global warming, I've heard it called global weirding. And that's really like, you start to say, oh, okay, so we get a really cold winter with a lot of snow, and then the next winter is really warm. Then you have a like false winter in October, and then a really warm, it's like you're going to have less predictability because of the volatility in our climate. And what you need in order to have a concentrated set for harvest is predictability. You want it to all flower at the same time and then harvest it all at the same time. Otherwise, it's really inefficient to hand harvest when you're picking through, and that's trouble. And also, if you get too much rain when the coffee is ripe, it can fall off the plant, which happens with our blueberries as well. So here's a picture that I took of rotting coffee in Rio Negro, because it had just been too wet that year that we came. And, that's gonna not taste good as well. So your farmer's losing all that effort due to unforeseen climate impacts. So then we also talked about how with the climate change, you're going to have more frequent and more intense drought and more frequent and more intense rain. And so drought is really trouble for coffee farmers because they end up having smaller beans and fewer of them. And so when you're picking and you have big beans, it takes half as much time to get a certain weight as it does when you're picking and you have small beans. Just like with blueberries. You know, I come back to that because I grow blueberries, but when we're picking the plant that has all those big blueberries, you know, my little gallon bucket fills pretty fast versus we've got some plants that are tiny and you're like, okay, that's a lot of work for not very many, although they taste good. You know, one other thing to note is that drought not only affects the coffee, but also affects the pine forests in Honduras. Just like in the American West, where you have these pine bark beetles that are causing trouble in Colorado and California and all across the West, that infestation of beetles is made worse by weakening the trees due to drought and warmer temperatures. And so we've had forest fires and tree die-offs all over Honduras. That pine tree habitat overlaps with the coffee farmers. And we actually had one of the coffee farmers died when a tree fell on him as he was doing work to try to mitigate the pine bark beetle. We already talked about landslides and roads being blocked and erosion, and then coffee falling off the trees with rain events. So climate change has so many impacts on coffee. Here's looking down at a landslide from above in Rio Negro, one of the coffee growing communities. And here we're looking across, and you can see a landslide here, but there were others like here and here and here. This was after a particularly bad storm a few years ago. And this is a little landslide. Mini landslides happen all over the place. You know, the mountain, you know, it's always susceptible to erosion, especially when you don't have trees on it anymore. And so when you're cutting down trees to have sun-grown coffee, you're going to make things worse for landslides. So we talked about climate refugees, those 1.7 million people who were out of work in Central America due to the Roya. But if you add into the drought, the extreme rainfall events, the low prices, you're getting a situation where the bottom is dropping out of the economy in Honduras and Guatemala and Nicaragua due to what should have been lots of income coming in from coffee, either drying up or coming at more and more expensive cost. So climate change raises the cost and risks of doing farming coffee, but it doesn't raise the price. The price depends on other factors, like, you know, whether Brazil is having a good year with their machine harvested coffee. 2018, the wholesale price of coffee dipped close to the cost of production, and workers didn't want to pick coffee for wages that farmers could afford to pay. So there was a lot of coffee in Honduras that just didn't get picked that year. All right, let's talk about adaptations to climate change. Like, what are the farmers going to do, and what are they doing? So first, let's think about the pests and diseases. We've already talked about resistant varieties, but you can move up the mountain to go higher and get colder temperatures, which will reduce your pest and your disease load. The shade trees will actually keep it cooler and provide habitat for pollinators and predatory insects. But shade reduces yield, which may be good because it reduces the stress on the plant. So like reducing yield isn't always bad. And then you can fertilize your plants with compost and our farmers are using special compost that they make using, they call it MAMA, microorganismos de la montaña, so mountain microorganisms. So they go up to the mountain and get soil from the actual forest and mix it in with their compost, and then spread that on the around their plants.
Excuse me, Andy.
Yeah.
When farmers move up the mountain, at least if it's in the cloud forest area, then that also would increase impact on other species and the viability of the cloud forest as well, though, right? So that's another conundrum there, I assume.
Yeah, that's a huge negative. From someone whose whole purpose for 3 years was to protect the cloud forest. It's hard to overestimate the value of the cloud forest to the people of Honduras. Every mountaintop that has a cloud forest is like a sponge that soaks up water. And so when it rains, that forest, it has like a thick carpet of moss and decomposing leaves and everything, and roots that makes that rain soak into the ground. And then that rain that soaks into the ground makes springs, which make rivers and creeks that then give water to the valleys for drinking water, for irrigation water, and so on. And in addition, the cloud forest, when a cloud comes in, even if it doesn't rain, the cloud forest, these trees are 100 feet tall. They're swarming with ferns and plants that grow on the trees themselves. And there's moss everywhere. And every place there's a surface, water condenses. They call it horizontal precipitation. And so that horizontal precipitation will drip, 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 even when it's not raining, and refill those aquifers. The opposite happens when there's no cloud forest. That when it rains, you get flooding, and then it dries up. The springs dry up, and the farms in the valley don't have water for irrigation. There's no water for hydroelectric. The potable water is not available. So if they can protect their cloud forests, the tops of the mountains should be protected forest, and there should be a ring of coffee farms around the middle of the mountain where if they're growing under shade trees, then you get a situation where the coffee farms themselves help to protect the water resource as well. So it's a nightmare scenario for farmers all over the country to move up the mountain and cut down the forest and then grow sun-grown coffee. So moving up the mountain is kind of scary. We've already talked about how the tree canopy can slow down the intense rainfall. Trees also act to moderate temperatures. Fallen leaves are mulch. In addition to shade trees, we get to see our organic farmers are using trenches and live barriers. So you'll plant a thick, you make a terrace using plants that cuts across the level of the mountain. And so then as rain comes down, it hits the thick growth of plants, and then it deposits its soil, and it slows the rain down, and then it slows down erosion. The goal is to have very little runoff, and then to sink that water in so that it can do good over a longer period of time. And then right where there is a waterway, you should have a buffer. You should have a protected forest area right near the water. And that's one of the issues with the landslides in that community that I started with, was that if you don't have a protected forest right where the stream is, when that stream grows, it doesn't have any roots that will stop it from just tearing the soil away. And if it starts to tear the soil away, it will undermine, and then things will collapse. And once things collapse, and if it's steep, then things can collapse from 50 to 100 to 200 feet up the mountain all at once, and it all comes down in one big landslide. So obviously watershed protection is a huge issue. So this is one of those live barriers. This is a plant called the sword of San Miguel, and you can plant it along the contour, and it will form a dense thatch and stop any water and leaves and soil. We talked about resisting climate change. There's resistant varieties, and they're actually looking at hybrids. And, as the science comes along, that might become an issue. Right now, they can only be propagated from tissue samples, which is kind of science-y sort of way to do things. Sort of like if you were grafting tomatoes. You do a lot of work to get one little tomato plant, but it might be worth it in the long run. Moving up the mountain, I've already said this is terrifying to me, so I don't need to talk more about that. But this is what's at stake. This is that cloud forest that I was talking about. There's tree ferns and mosses and huge trees and small trees, and it's a jungle, a literal jungle on the tops of the mountains. And here's the park that I was working to protect. They had these dreams of ecotourism to protect the mountain. And in Honduras, part of our policy towards Central America has enabled gangs and drug lords and Salvadoran gangs to take hold and, what did I do? Resume share, okay. To take hold of the country. And so now Honduras is not a safe place for people to visit. And so tourism is gone. One of the options for farmers would be diversification. And that's always like a option for vegetable farmers. You don't want to just put all your eggs in one basket. But for coffee farmers, they don't really have a lot of options to send to make up that sort of money that you can make from coffee. Cardamom was offered as a possibility many years ago, but that, as soon as coffee farmers around the world started growing cardamom, the bottom dropped out of that market and it wasn't worth it. Also, cardamom, you pick on your hands and knees versus standing up with coffee. And cardamom, snakes live in the cardamom plants. So there's venomous snakes in Honduras, one of them called the fer de lance, and it's one of the few snakes that will actually pursue people. Mostly snakes, venomous snakes will, bite people out of being surprised. Corn and beans, people say, oh, well, you can just grow your own food. But really, the United States, through various trade deals, has destroyed the corn and beans market in Central America. We can grow corn and we can grow beans much cheaper than they can for the same machinery versus hand harvesting. And so as a money maker, corn and beans is non-existent in Honduras. Fruits and vegetables, there's a lot of vegetables that get sent to the United States from Honduras and other places. And there's a decent market for vegetables inside the country, but it's nothing near what you can make growing coffee. Pine resin, there's actually some work being done with pine resin for the last 20 some years. And that eventually kills the pine tree, but if you have a healthy forest, you can regenerate. And that there are farmers, especially on the south side of the mountain, who are taking advantage of that. But really what most of the farmers, in response to the difficulties they've had and the low prices, is that they've been planting more coffee. And you can see that on a global scale, this is just going to drive the price down more. it's like our farmers near around us who are in historically low prices for corn, but they're planting more corn because, you know, if the price is low, you might as well, you know, plant more in order to make the same amount of money that you used to. But what's called for is something that you could, like, if you could control the market and lower the production of coffee, you might be able to get the prices up. So for us as farmers, as farmer to farmer, price is the only way to support farmers growing coffee and mitigating climate change at the same time. And so we at Farmer to Farmer, we pay significantly higher than even the organic fair trade prices that the farmers are getting. And in addition to that, we offer relationships of solidarity so that when there are issues like the 3 farmers who are going to have to be forced to move, we know about that and we're thinking about them, and we're doing a fundraiser. So you probably get an e-blast this week. So what can coffee farmers do to mitigate climate change? So they can protect the nearby forests, local cooling like microclimates and erosion control. They can build their soil, because soil carbon not only is the best way to have healthy plants, but it's also the best carbon sink we have. So as organic farmers in the United States, the more carbon we have in our soil, the less there is in the air. So you can get carbon to the soil through mulch, compost, biochar, just organic methods in general. You can plant shade trees, which add carbon to the soil by dropping their leaves and through their biomass. You can do terracing. And then we can lower the carbon footprint on our end of the business. So coffee has that potential to actually slow down climate change. If you think about it, the way that coffee used to be produced under a forest is really compatible with our idea of a permaculture style farming, of regenerative farming, where you can actually have a crop that you can harvest in the middle of a forest that is doing all these climate services. So coffee is really, it has that possibility if we can figure out how to reward farmers who are able to make those changes. Something to think about is that climate change is hitting the poorest people the hardest. And that's hard for us in the global north to realize, is that we're like, well, you know, it might rain more, there might be more droughts here, but you know, it's actually a little bit warmer in Wisconsin. And you know, we can grow more crops here, and we start to think climate change might not be that big of a deal. And then you look at those hurricanes, you look at the droughts, you look at the impacts on people in tropical areas and actually in Arctic areas as well. The impacts of climate change are not necessarily being felt by the people who are emitting the carbon. And so we talked about climate refugees earlier. You know, this situation of caravans of people on the border, if there was a healthy economy in Central America propped up by strong prices for coffee and tourism that functioned because of not having as much violence, there wouldn't be as many people leaving Central America. So what's important? If you're going to be a coffee farmer nowadays, you have to be aware of all the different ways that you can mitigate the impacts of climate change on your farm. So education is really important. And Farmer to Farmer works with the farmers in the co-op they mostly learn from each other, but I think having a co-op and having us support that co-op is helpful. But really the farmers themselves are teaching each other. There's nothing I can come down and tell them about growing coffee, but education is huge. And we're supporting education of their young people. So getting the advanced and even high school education is really important. Having high predictable prices, and that's something that we offer. When commodity prices go up and down, it's hard for farmers to plan. Personal relationships, we need to be aware of when things are happening so that we can support that. And this happened in Guatemala as well. There was a Hurricane Stan, who came through, like, I don't know, 15 years ago. And many, many people died in the Santiago Atitlan area, and homes were lost, and we knew about it. And so we were able to send money and support and ask what else we can do. And then we need to stop climate change on our end. And this is who we're doing it for. This is Doña Cirila with her grandchildren. I'm going to exit screen sharing. And I'm willing to take some questions. And if people have some conversation that they'd like to offer, that's great too. Thank you to Mike for hosting us today as well.
I have a question for you, Andy.
Yeah.
So, there's places like Farmer to Farmer and Wonder State and several others that are paying farmers better than anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Happen to know what kind of impact that's having in terms of a percent on coffee farmers? I feel like it's pretty minimal.
Yeah,
it's like that's the thing that really needs to change.
In Honduras, we're driving up to visit this one coffee farm who's sending us coffee, and we're driving for 2 hours through other coffee farms, and we finally get to the one coffee farm that we're going to see, and we're discovering that we're only buying like 10% of their crop. And so even for that one coffee farm, they're having to sell their coffee at lower prices. So this is the sort of thing that we need a bigger revolution faster, but this is the best we can do right now. There's a lot of coffee out there being grown and just sold for very low prices. Yeah, we just do our best.
Yep.
Good to see you, John.
Andy, do you have I remember in the 90s, I was in grad school and there was a piece put out by the World Watch Institute in their State of the World book that they put out every year.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the essays in there was Denial in the Decisive Decade. And that was in the 90s.
Yeah.
And the point being, if we deny climate change this year, this is a decisive decade, or this decade, and we just haven't addressed it in the 90s, the aughts, or now, up till now, really. And so, yeah, I mean, there's been progress, but in terms of actual decrease in emissions and so on, I guess what I'm getting at is that I feel quite a bit of grief about it, and
yeah,
loss. And so I feel like there's something like what might be helpful to someone like me or others who feel that grief and loss to move through it, to kind of, well, what now? I mean, I feel like I've been at it so long, and I'm not sure what to do anymore. But I guess what I'm also getting at or wondering about is your sense of the farmers you work with, how it impacts them emotionally, or like, are they feeling like at a loss, or how's it impacting their well-being? Obviously, it's impacting their economics and, you know, their landscape. And so it must be overwhelming at some level, but I'm wondering how your sense is how they're doing.
Well, you know, like one of the things with farming is that the day-to-day things that you deal with are much bigger than the kind of broad trends. So we farmers are much more likely to like be impacted by a weather event that we might not say is climate change. We might just say it was a really bad rain, or this is a really bad drought. These are just things that have always happened, was rains and drought. And so as farmers, I don't think, except for maybe Hector, the farmers there are saying, oh, this is climate change. You know, this is these are sorts of things that you see only with long-term looks at trends. You might say, oh, this is a bad year for insects. Well, we have bad years for insects and we have good years for insects. You know, it's a sort of like slow erosion of the quality of the growing conditions that you don't really notice if you're just living at a kind of on a micro scale. And so like that might be one of the reasons why farmers in the United States are more likely to deny climate change, even though they're living it, is because, you know, there's always been droughts and floods and insects and diseases. You know, so you don't really think of it as climate, you think of it as weather. And so like it's hard to like have grief over something that you're in denial about. You're just having your own struggles, and you've always had struggles. I don't see our farmer friends in grief so much as just struggling.
Has COVID hit there, Andy?
Oh yeah.
I mean, Rio
COVID,
Negro. I know it's hit Honduras. But
yeah,
Rio Negro too.
yeah. The communities, the issue is worse in the cities, you know, and people sort of like here, the rural communities feel like, wow, those city people are having it hard, and they're just living their life out in the country. But in the cities, they're not. People are not allowed to leave their house except on certain days, depending on what their last digit of their identity card is. And so they have really restricted movement in the country, and it's really affected, you know, a lot of livelihoods of people who would like be selling vegetables in the streets and stuff. But right now, the COVID, right before the hurricane, the COVID was filling up the hospitals. They were at a tipping point, sort of like we are now. They were just seeing more and more. So COVID is right now, Honduras, we're sending money every 6 weeks, $50 to each family in the co-op, just so that they can make basic needs. And that's also, we're sending money to people in Guatemala as well. And so with the hurricane, we're also going to send a chunk to the 3 families who are being forced to move. So it's kind of like double whammy.
Andy, is farmer to farmer able to send that money mainly through coffee sales, or do you also raise money?
We raise money for the COVID relief and for the hurricane relief and for scholarships as well. So the coffee sales, the main thing that we want to avoid is this sort of like, we want to pay them enough money that they make the money off of the coffee and not from us buying cheap coffee, having profits, and then sending money back. So we pay them up front higher, which means there isn't as much like slop in the coffee business to create profits that we send back. But I think that leads to more dignity, and it also like undermines this idea of the sort of the white savior group of people who are gathering money, making money off of their cheap coffee, and then, you know, now we dole it out in little bits. with that being said, we do raise money for education, which we think is hugely important, especially with women and girls. And we have students in Guatemala who are graduating university after years of support from Farmer to Farmer. And we're really proud of that. And then with the COVID, we just made a decision that we have to raise money so that, especially in Guatemala, there were people who, families who make a lot of money through weaving, and the tourism dried up immediately with the COVID. And so all the market for weavings dried up as well. So the basic needs are kind of like, we need to keep people alive and out of extreme poverty. And so $50 might not seem that much, but $50 can buy a lot of rice and beans and corn and basic staples and keep people from hunger. So that's been our goal with raising money this year. We think of ourselves as a solidarity organization. So more than just trying to raise money to give money, it's more about the personal relationships. And we think that when we have a trip, it's just as much, we learn just as much coming to Honduras or Guatemala, and it enriches us just as much as it might enrich them to have a relationship with us. We really kind of see our common humanity.
You mentioned weavers, Andy.
I hear you.
Jody's store in Maiden Rock seems to be somewhat of an outlet for the weavers. Is that continuing?
Yeah, Jody, if you ever get down to Maiden Rock, Stephanie, you might like this. Our friend Jody has a store called Cultural Cloth, and she was telling me how she's been banned from some of the money sending apps, those like Zoom and MoneyGram and these things, because she buys so much textiles from around the world, and they, she keeps sending up red flags that she's somehow maybe she's paying for drugs or something, but really what she's doing is buying sustainably produced textiles around the world. So she's kind of got that same ethos going with textiles that we have with coffee. And she sells coffee at the store too.
I'm curious, in 05 when we went to Lake Antidlan, we helped with the Weavers Workshop. Is that still a viable entity, or is that not functioning anymore?
Well, I know that it never became like the store that they wanted it to be, but they ended up renting out those rooms that we were putting cement on the walls for, and they had an income from that. I'm not sure, Sue, you might have more information about that. No, you're muted, Sue.
And are you talking about the property that was bought?
Yeah, that we helped build.
Yeah, we saw that when we were down there, me and my husband Alan, and they're renting the property out. I don't think they actually built on it for themselves, but it's a source of income.
Yeah, so Steph, that was one of the things that we did as an organization, was this Weavers Co-op in Guatemala. We were able to loan them money and have a crew of gringos show up to help build on this property that they were able to buy. And so that's part of our solidarity, is sometimes we do loans to get people on their feet.
Andy, do you want to tell them about the Honduran property that we're helping them out with?
Yeah, we're doing a similar thing with the Honduran group. One of the problems with education in Honduras is that there are no high schools in the coffee growing communities. It's just, it's too small. And so, people who don't have vehicles, you can't, it takes an hour to drive down to the city anyway. So you can't commute to high school. So if you get to 6th grade, you're done. And so unless you have like family who live in a city, you can't go to school. And so they end up, that really cuts into their ability to educate their young people. And so what our farmers are doing is we've been supporting students to go to a Catholic boarding school for rural kids. And so that's been good. But what they want to do is they want to actually buy a lot and build a little house that they can have their teenagers live in with, someone from the family. And that house will also be a little storehouse for them to store their coffee as well. So all these farmers live in different communities on the mountain. And so they were, with farmer to farmer support, they were able to buy a lot in a neighborhood that's growing. And so they've got some money that they're saving up to build that boarding house for their teens. So that's kind of exciting. I did notice that neighborhood flooded with the recent hurricane. So maybe we'll have to build it on, stilts or something. Well, any more questions? We do have a coupon that I'm going to drop in the chat for those who came. It's for $5 off any coffee at the online store. And you use the promo code CLIMATE, all caps. And so Farmer to Farmer has a website, and you can buy coffee there, and you probably use it for other items. I think we have t-shirts. I'm not sure. Sue would know better than me. But please go and redeem your coupon and enjoy Farmer to Farmer coffee.
Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. Thanks everyone for
see you,
showing up.
Andy.
It's good to see
I
some
have a
familiar
question
faces.
first. Steph, do you sell farmer to farmer coffee at the co-op? I'm just wondering where people can get it in the area, because we sell it at Farm Table if you want to get it at Farm Table. Do you have it up in Luck?
I don't. I serve Wonder.
Okay, gotcha.
And those Wonder State guys, they actually were really helpful to us. There's kind of like some real cooperation that happens in the coffee community. It's really nice. And I think they actually visited the farmers in Honduras, and we even sent them some coffee. And the year that we sent it to them, there were some issues with off flavors due to moisture in the coffee. And so the Wonder State guys actually helped us go through and troubleshoot why those off flavors came about. And now our farmers have an even higher quality. And that's part of the cooperation that we get from people like Wonder State, who at that time were called Kickapoo. So like 3 cheers to them, and good job, Steph. And hopefully you can go on one of their trips, but you'd be welcome to go on our trips too.
Right. And did I tell you that when I was in Santiago in February, I ran into Jody?
It is a small world.
All world situation. Yeah.
She gets around.
That's true.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I need to actually get going. I came into Farm Table because they've got better Wi-Fi, but I'm looking out the window and it's the rain turned to snow about 20 minutes ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we better get home, Andy.
Okay.
But
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Andy, for your time tonight. And thank you for coming, everybody. I also typed in our website on there if you want to check it out. Have a good evening, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.